Welcome to Brain Navat. Today is another special episode in that I'm joined by one of the most excellent philosophers I know, our producer, Ella Coleman. And we are going to be interviewing one of my favorite professors at Rhodes, Connor Kianpour. And we're going to be talking about child's rights, which is why I'm wearing this very childish outfit. Connor, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Um, so suppose that someone was involuntarily committed to a rehabilitation facility for their substance abuse disorder. Many people would be open to at least one of the following two justifications for this kind of involuntary commitment. So, on the one hand, the person with the substance abuse disorder might, because of their disorder, pose an undue risk of harm to third parties. So, think of the person who gets extremely violent when they're drunk. Um, Thus, people would be justified in constraining their liberty, the person who has these tendencies, and controlling their life at least temporarily, so as to protect third parties from this undue risk of harm. On the other hand, the person with the substance abuse disorder might, because of their disorder, pose an undue risk of harm to themselves. And I acknowledge that hardcore anti paternalists will be skeptical of this, but I think it's worth pointing out that even John Stuart Mill, who was quite anti paternalistic in his commitments, believe that we could act paternalistically so long as we're suitably justified in believing that our intervention is what the person we're interfering with truly desires. So perhaps the person with the substance abuse disorder truly desires remaining alive, and their substance abuse disorder threatens their ability to remain alive. Perhaps they have a particularly acute case of cirrhosis of the liver. So even people with robust anti-paternalist commitments could acknowledge that someone with a substance abuse disorder could be involuntarily committed to rehab because doing so would be in their interests. However, I don't think anybody would claim that the interest that those running the rehab center have in having an additional patient should figure into the explanation for why someone should be involuntarily committed to that facility. And I think that there are two features of the case that leads us to analyzing this situation in this way. So first, the person who's being considered for involuntary commitment is in a vulnerable position in which they need another individual to control their lives, either for their own sake or for the sake of others. And second, the fact that the person who would be doing the controlling in this scenario, the individuals who run the rehab center, there are conflicts of interest between them and the person whose life they're controlling. And so to say that we should take the interests of the people running the rehab like seriously in determining whether or not to involuntarily commit somebody is a recipe for basically involuntarily committing a lot of people for the sake of people that run rehabs. So I think that the fact that these two features obtain in the case, the fact that there is vulnerability of the person whose life that's being controlled, and a conflict of interest or a potential for domination by the individual that's doing the controlling in the situation, calls for us to analyze this case morally differently than we would other cases. And in particular, the analysis is different because I just think we should not focus on the interests of the people that run the rehab facility at all in determining whether or not this person should be involuntarily committed there. So you might say at this point, like, Connor, you're going too far here. But I first want to point out that it's odd to think that if there are two willing rehabilitation facilities that would fare equally well at rehabilitating someone with a substance abuse disorder, it would just be odd to suggest that we ought to allow the facility that would benefit more from an additional patient to take the patient. You might say if the facility were to benefit more, that would be better for the patient. since the people working at the facility would be more motivated to safeguard the patient's interests. But at that point, you're saying that we should admit the patient to the facility because it would be best for the patient, which shows you're discounting the interests of the people who work at the facility, which is what I'm inclined to do. So now the lesson that I think we're supposed to extract from this sort of case leads us to particular judgments about parenting that some people might find surprising. So I think that this sort of case that I presented you with is analogous to parenting in two ways. First, parents exercise global authority over the lives of their children. Um, and second, the children whose lives they exercise global authority over are vulnerable to them and in need of them to protect their interests for them. So I think given that this vulnerability and this potential for domination exists in both the case of the rehab facility and in the case of parenting, we ought to discount the interests of the people that run the rehab facility, and we ought to discount the interests of parents when determining what we should do for either the rehab facility patient or children. So I had mentioned earlier that I would talk a little bit about why I think that sufficiency should be the bar of justice for children rather than the alternative of maximality. So those who believe in maximality being the bar of justice, they think that children are owed the best possible upbringings that they could be given. Those who think sufficiency should be the bar of justice for children think that children are owed good enough upbringings, whatever that term means. And I personally don't think that necessary and sufficient conditions can be given for what a good enough upbringing is, and that we should instead use intuitions to help fill out our idea of what a good enough upbringing is. But I thought to give two arguments in defense of sufficiency being the bar of justice for children rather than maximality. So here's a negative argument against maximality. And the argument goes something like this. If we were to say that maximality is the bar of justice for children, we clearly do not think that maximality is the bar of justice for adults. And so by positing that, we would be positing an asymmetry between what children and what adults are owed. And I think that the kind of difference that is being posited here is problematic. It would be akin to saying that whereas females are owed sufficiently good lives, males are owed the best possible lives they could be given. We can resolve this sort of like tension by recognizing that like to give a female a sufficiently good life and to give a male a sufficiently good life, you might have to do different things for them, such as when it comes to like healthcare, right? But we can ultimately recognize that the substance of their claims are identical, that they're owed the same kinds of things, even though what you have to do to get them those same kinds of things might be different. So I think that we can hold on to this idea that we owe children different things than we do adults, while ultimately recognizing that adults and children are owed sufficiently good lives. And I think also that there's this problem with raising a child such that they believe that what they're owed is the best possible upbringing, only for them to become adults and to then be treated by everybody as though they're owed no more than enough. I think that that produces potential issues with the development of the capacity for self-respect, being able to value oneself appropriately. If for all of your life up until the point that you reach the age of majority, you're treated as though you're owed the most. And then at the age of majority, you're treated as though you're not owed that. That I imagine could do a number on somebody. And beyond that, I think that sufficiency paradoxically is better for children than maximality is. When you treat a child as though they're owed the best possible upbringing, you paradoxically like spoil them in such a way that they end up having a life that's worse than the life that they would have if they had to encounter some trials, some tribulations, and they had to develop character. And obviously, I want to recognize that there's like a limit to how much you could put a child through for the sake of developing their character. But certainly, if all children were treated as though they are owed the best possible upbringings, I suspect you would have a generation of parents that would treat their children horribly. And I think that we need to recognize that by giving children less, sometimes we're actually giving them more.
So in practice, do you envision there being a threshold for a sufficiently good upbringing that a child requires? And if so, how would you anticipate defining this standard across cultural, socioeconomic, and political contexts?
I think in order to explain my answer, I should first make clear an assumption that I take for granted that some people do not. I'm an objectivist about welfare, particularly for children. So, what this means is that I think that there are things that can be good or bad for people, irrespective of whether or not they take those things to be good or bad for them. I can be mistaken about what's good or bad for me, is another way of putting it. So I do think that there are certain kinds of goods that like all children would benefit from. And I think if the goalpost for what children are owed should be set at the bar of sufficiency, which is what I'm inclined to think, and we can talk more about that over the course of the discussion, I think that we can look to um, certain kinds of goods or bads that everybody can recognize are good or bad for children. So, for instance, severe abuse and neglect. There are obviously cases in which it's not quite clear whether or not a child is being abused or neglected, but there are also cases in which it's obvious that a child is being abused or neglected. Say, the case of a parent who intentionally and willfully on a regular basis pours boiling water on a young child. I think everybody is willing to agree that like severe abuse is occurring in a case like that. So I would want to first like focus on those cases in which it's very, very clear that something bad is happening for children, and then have our sociopolitical institutions reflect that protection from those things is going to be good for children. Um, but then beyond this, I think there are some interests that children can have that are not clearly like severely abusive or related to protection from severe abuse and neglect, that nevertheless are strong enough interests to generate rights for them. So I'm thinking, for instance, of associational rights that children might have. So I'm sure that people are familiar either through popular culture, film, literature, media, or their personal lives of cases in which a child has parents that have divorced, and then one of the parents, the one who ends up gaining full custody of the child, is kind of like capricious and mean toward the other partner and tries to prevent the other partner from associating with the child, even though the child wants to associate with the partner, and it would be good for the child to associate with the partner. Now, I don't think that preventing a child from associating with another adult whose association is good for the child necessarily constitutes an act of abuse or neglect. Um, but I think even if it doesn't necessarily constitute an act of abuse or neglect, we can say that the interest that children have in associating with such adults is so important that they nevertheless have a right to it. And I think that the fact that our social and political institutions are organized in ways that try to ensure parents and children have visitation rights with respect to each other gives us at least some evidence to think that that sort of claim is true. So because I take myself to be an applied ethicist, I'm going to focus mostly on like cases that are clear of what it takes for a child to have a sufficiently good life, rather than trying to give you like necessary and sufficient conditions for what such a good life might look like, because I'm not optimistic that such conditions exist for like every single child.
So, Connor, one objection that someone could raise about the case you started with is that we expect people who are running a care facility to have the best interests of the people they care for at heart, but there is no special relationship there. They didn't bring those people into existence. All patients will largely be seen as sort of interchangeable with each other, that you care about treating a problem like drug addiction. Along the way, you might very well form some meaningful relationships, but we also expect them to end. That once you are out of the treatment facility, we don't expect you to maintain a strong bond with the people who look after you. But parents, the general expectation is that their interests are meant to be long-term, that even under conditions where things get rocky, we expect those interests and bonds to remain. And that even under conditions where a parent acts badly, we might think that it's in the best interest of the child for that relationship to at some point be restored in a way that we wouldn't if you had, a nurse who slapped you around, treated you badly. We'd say, well, there's no reason why you ever need to see the nurse ever again. But there'll be but she's your mother line, that even she did this terrible, horrific thing to you, you have to keep the bond open. That it's like really needs to a very high threshold before you can say you can sever this relationship. And part of that seems to be about taking into account the interest of the parents. That, even if we think it may very well be in the best interest of a child to no longer see their parent, we think that maintaining the bond for the parent's sake plays some role on the scale. So I'm wondering if you think that these things are sufficiently distinguishing, and therefore if we can sort of place some parental interest on the scale, that's going to change the general policy that we build up.
Okay, so I guess I have two responses. So the first is like a trying to maybe offer some kind of debunking explanation for why people's judgments are different in these two cases. So, like, perhaps the reason, and this might come across as cynical, but uh, perhaps the reason that people think that a child should continue associating with a parent, even if things get rocky, and that this sort of association is supposed to be long term in this robust way that isn't the case when it comes to the rehab facility. Um, I think that just might be a feature of the fact that our society has organized itself in ways that make it so that parents are effectively treated as the owners of their children. That uh, phrase comes to mind of like parents who say, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it. So if we're already in a society like that, that puts that much of a premium on the relationship, of course, our judgments are going to be different between the two cases. And then I could just imagine that if we were to start putting that same sort of premium on the relationship between healthcare professionals and their patients, that we would find a lot more symmetry between the cases. But I don't think that we should necessarily allow for that difference in judgment to be like determinative in treating the cases differently, morally speaking. Um, and then the second sort of response that I want to give is a bit more concessive. So I do think that there is a sense in which parents do have interests with respect to their children that might be worth taking into account for the purposes of, say, public policy. But I just don't think that these interests are interests that parents have qua parents, which is to say, I don't think that parents have interests in being the kinds of individuals who exercise global authority over their children's lives that matter morally for the purposes of public policy. But I do think that parents might have interests qua associates of children. So you say that even after a parent has like finished like parenting a child and rearing them, that there's like an expectation that the child and the parent will remain in contact in some kind of robust way. But notice how at that point, we're not talking about sustaining a relationship in which one party exercises global control over the other party's life. Now we're talking about a relationship in which one party associates with another in a more or less like equal peer-like manner, even though the like parent-child relationship might color how that association is realized. So I do think that parents can have interests qua the associates of children, um, but I don't think that they can have interests qua parent that are morally relevant.
So, you argue that justice for children should focus only on the child's interests and not the parents. But there are cases like keeping family bonds or preserving cultural identity where a parent's interests might still matter. So, say a parent can't provide a sufficient upbringing, but wants ongoing contact to pass on their language and culture. Even if the child is thriving elsewhere, could the parent's interest in preserving that cultural bond matter morally in your framework?
I guess the response that I'm inclined to give here is that uh, I think in order to take cultural interests seriously, we would have to be able to recognize that uh, cultures like have rights to exist or something of that nature. I don't think that cultures have rights to exist. I think that individuals can have rights to engage in particular cultural practices. I think that individuals should be allowed to uh, engage in different kinds of cultural practices if they want, even if it's the kind of cultural practice that they weren't born into, so to speak. Um, but I don't think that a culture can have rights to continue existing. And if that's the case, I don't think that those interests can be appealed to explain why a particular parent should be allowed to raise a child. Now, I want to acknowledge that that has some like unpalatable implications for people. So, for instance, in the United States, there's a piece of legislation called the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA. And ICWA basically establishes a presumption in favor of Native American parents raising Native children. So that if there was a Native American child that was up for adoption, adoption agencies would have to look for Native parents to adopt the child before they considered adopting the child off to a white family. Now, I want to echo some concerns that individuals before me have raised with these kinds of presumptions in favor of children being raised by members of a certain culture. So Elizabeth Bartholet argued in the 90s that these sorts of race matching policies in adoption have by and large been to the detriment of children. Um, People think that if we establish these legislative presumptions in favor of children being adopted off by people who share a race, ethnicity, or culture with them, that it would ultimately be in the child's interest to be raised by somebody who shares this ethnicity, race, or culture. But what ends up happening most of the time is that there aren't enough members of that race, ethnicity, or culture willing to adopt needy children. And so the children end up staying in the foster care system for a longer period of time, adoptions delayed, their interests are basically discounted for the sake of these cultural interests that I'm trying to claim are not as important as the interests of children themselves. So I don't think that cultural interests can really figure into an explanation for why a particular child should be reared by certain parents.
So I want to pick up on the idea of the objective interest of the child. So I take it that that's not merely what the child says is in their interests. It's meant to be what is objectively good for them. So one of the controversies that's sort of been in the press a lot of the last couple of years are cases where a child purports to come out as being a different sex, and will say to the parents at a young age, I was born a boy and I actually view myself as a girl, and I would like to take various measures to make this be a reality, surgery, hormones, etc. Now, you can imagine different adults being in the life of the child. So let's say the parents, teachers, and a doctor. Now, you could imagine that these different people have different views on what should be done with the child. So you can imagine a doctor that says, well, we're in the business of gender affirming care. And once the child has articulated a preference to change sex, we must affirm that choice. You can imagine, let's say, one of the parents being on board with this, the other one being obstinately against it, and then maybe different teachers at the school taking different views. The one say your child would definitely flourish very well if they were to change sex, and the other saying this is going to be very harmful for your kid down the line. They're going to get severely bullied by the other kids. Don't do it. What are we supposed to do under these conditions, given your theoretical framework?
So I think that we can use the judgments that we have about other kinds of cases to help figure out what we should do in this one. So I think there are two judgments that might be relevant here. The first is the judgment that a lot of people, especially on the political left, have, that it's wrong for parents to be able to authorize their children to pursue gay conversion therapy, even if it would be like effective. So obviously there are these arguments about gay conversion therapy like not being effective and that it's harmful for children, right? But there has been some work by like Brian Earp, Candice Delmas, Sean Oss, in which they consider this possibility of a future where gay conversion therapy is like costless to the child in terms of its like physiological, psychological costs, etc. And it's actually effective. Um, and so while all of the thinkers that I just listed, they're quite open to adults of sound mind making the choice to pursue such kinds of gay conversion therapy. Um, they obviously do not have that same sort of judgment for children, right? They say, even if we allow adults of sound mind to pursue gay conversion therapy when it's effective and when it's not harmful, we should not necessarily apply that same sort of lesson to the case of children. And then the question is like, why, right? And then setting that aside for one moment, another sort of case that I think is instructive here is the judgments that people have about sex between an adult and a child, even in those cases where the child initiates the sexual encounter. So in a lot of states in the United States, I think all of them actually, even if there's a child that wants to have sex with a particular adult, it would still be criminal for the adult to have sex with that child. And then the question is like, why? Why do we do this in these two cases? So my suggestion is that when it comes to the sexual body, particularly of minors, we recognize that there's a lot more at stake when it comes to sexual identity, sexual anatomy, the hormones of a minor, and like interfering with those things than with virtually anything else. And so even in those cases where a minor might want to pursue either sex with an adult or gay conversion therapy, we can invoke this sort of principle that draws this prophylactic line around the sexual body and say, well, because it involves the sexual body in these cases, we're justified in nevertheless criminalizing these things. And so I think the fact that pediatric gender transition involves intervening in the sexual body in arguably some of the most invasive ways you possibly can. Um, I think that violates that very same principle that people might invoke in the cases of gay conversion therapy being illegal, even in those cases where it's like harmless, effective, and the child wants it, and those cases of adult child sex. And so I think we should err on the side of caution and generally just prohibit minors from pursuing those kinds of procedures.
Could your child centered framework be extended to other dependent populations, such as elderly individuals with, say, dementia or severely disabled adults who also lack autonomy? So, say you're visiting your grandparent in an elderly care home and you see that the living conditions there and the treatment there are substandard. Would it be okay to pluck a patient out of that environment? Or if not, why focus uniquely on children?
Um, so I do think that the general sort of framework that I'm working with is mostly concerned with like vulnerability and the possibility for domination. And given that there is another population other than children that satisfy those two conditions, I think that my general framework would apply to them as well. So I would go so far as to say like my child-centered framework could be used as the basis for like an animal-centered framework of like how pet owners should treat their pets, right? So I'm fully willing to say that my views have these like broader sorts of implications. Now, could there be something different about children that might, for people who are resistant to accepting all those other implications, be able to hold on to? I'm personally skeptical, but perhaps somebody could say that the fact that children could at one point become persons makes them distinct from these other kinds of populations. Like with the elderly, they were at one point persons, but they no longer are. And with animals, they can't become persons. So maybe that difference between children and these other groups could prove to be a relevant difference. I'm skeptical that it would be a relevant difference. Because to me, even if a child does not grow up to be an adult, and we had a crystal ball that would tell us that this child would not grow up to be an adult, I nevertheless think that I would have the same kinds of moral obligations to that child that I would a child that would grow up to become an adult.
So I want to try and give you a couple of hard cases to deal with. And these I think are real life cases. In Australia, you had a project where the Australians who descended from England looked at the Aboriginal children and the way that they were raised and took the view that they were being treated with neglect, that the kids weren't properly socialized, that they weren't fed on a regular basis, they weren't bathed on a regular basis, and the best thing for those children would be to separate them from their families and raise them by the state. I think you had similar things happening in North America with Native Americans. And then a different case would be ultra-Orthodox communities in New York, where the community raises children to speak Yiddish, not Hebrew, not English, and often won't teach them secular subjects. So they are often unable to lead ordinary lives outside of those communities, but the communities persist, and the community seems to have a strong interest in them persisting. So I wonder if you think that while those practices in North America and Australia have been widely condemned, maybe we were mistaken in condemning them, that the state might have done the right thing in a lot of those cases by taking those children away from their parents. And whether you think it would be okay to, let's say, for a third-party citizen to kidnap some of those Yiddish kids and raise them with other kinds of values so that they could lead a sufficiently good life.
Yeah. Okay. So I must admit that I'm not familiar enough with like the particulars of each of these cases to be able to like render a judgment about whether the state's intervening was like a good thing or a bad thing. But I guess what I will say, which might be satisfying to you, is that there are some conditions under which I think it would be appropriate for the state to have intervened. So, yeah, I guess I first want to start off by saying that one of the things that I'm most concerned with in these kinds of communities in which children are raised like completely separate and apart from others in the society at large is that like sometimes being raised in a community like that um, makes it so that if you were provided information about other opportunities outside of the community, you might find those other opportunities more appealing than the opportunities given to you in your community. So I think one thing that I would really like the state to be able to do in those cases, even if it's not to intervene and take the children away from these families, is to as the children are older and they have like more agency and they're able to understand things better, if the state were to provide children with information about options beyond the communities that they're born into, that they might be able to pursue. So I think that that would be an appropriate sort of intervention that allows for um, the children who are older, more agential, more autonomous, to remain within those communities if they so choose. But then it provides other children who might want a different life for themselves, at least with enough information to pursue a different course if they so choose. And now the question that you asked toward the end of what you had said about kidnapping. So I defend defensive kidnapping, which I understand as an adult who is a private citizen rather than a public official abducting a child from a set of severely abusive and neglectful circumstances and raising the child as their own. And I think that there are some cases in which somebody would be morally justified in carrying out such a kidnapping, and in which I believe that the state should not subject such a person to legal penalties. That isn't to say that I think that there should be a law on the books that legalizes defensive kidnapping. Rather, I'm partial to a system in which kidnapping in general is criminalized the way that it is. And we allow for public officials to exercise discretion in particular hard cases so that if a child was being raised by an adult who is far better than their default guardian, the child is flourishing under the stewardship of this guardian. Um, and the other parents from which the child was taken were not fit to rear the child in the first place. I think that it would be okay for public officials to turn the other cheek, so to speak, and allow for this new guardian to continue raising the child. Um, Now, obviously, there are these questions of like, can we really be confident that a particular adult is going to have enough information to know that severe abuse and neglect was taking place in a particular household? And should we trust that the people that would undertake these kinds of defensive kidnappings would actually safeguard the interests of children that they kidnap sufficiently? I think that at least in some cases, it would be better for a private citizen to conduct a defensive kidnapping than for public officials to intervene and to take the child out of a particular household, put them in the child welfare system, find potential parents to adopt them, etc. So I think defensive kidnapping like cuts out the middleman of placing the child in the child welfare system which we all know subjects children to a lot of harms. And there are individuals that children associate with who aren't their parents, who I would call important associates. So maybe these are the romantic partners of their parents, or neighbors, or mentors, teachers, counselors, etc., who know the children quite well. The children share a lot of information about their lives with these people. And I think that these people are often better positioned than public officials to know whether severe abuse or neglect is taking place in a particular living arrangement. And I think they're probably better positioned than public officials to take care of the children, especially if there was this established relationship between the child and the person who ends up kidnapping them. Now, obviously, I don't think that the fact that I think that there are these rare cases in which this would be justified does not mean that I'm saying, like, find a child who's being abused and neglected and kidnap them, like it'll be hunky-dory. I don't mean to endorse that at all. I just do think that there are enough cases in which somebody, and I'm thinking a lot of these individuals in Appalachia who have these substance abuse problems that interfere with their ability to be a good parent, and then grandparents or next of kin intervene in the living arrangement. They take the child and raise the child as their own. And there are some courts in West Virginia that, like, the original parent will go to the court and be like, this person took my kid away from me and they're raising them. And then the court looks at their medical records, reads testimony from neighbors about how this parent would, like, beat the child. And the court would just be like, well, this other person seems to be doing a much better job at raising your child than you are. So we're just going to let it ride for now. And I think that sort of practice is actually quite desirable and preferable to subjecting children to the harms of being ensnared in the child welfare system.
Who determines whether a biological parent's relationship is sufficiently in the child's interest to warrant protection? And by what criteria? Moreover, would this give the state too much interpretive power?
Yeah, so obviously, and I'm saying this as somebody who is deeply skeptical of state authority in a lot of domains. There is always going to, whenever a suggestion is made that the state should be meddling in something, there's always this worry that, like, should we trust the state to do this? Should we trust the state to really know whether a particular adult's association with a child is actually the type of association that should be protected? I think insofar as we are okay with the state doing this in the cases that it already does this, so in Appalachia, in the United States, there are lots of cases of grandparents who petition for visitation rights, if not adoptive rights, with respect to the young children of their children who are either in prison or in a rehab facility because of the opioid crisis in Appalachia. And it seems like we entrust the state to with a reasonable level of effectiveness, like protect children's associational rights with particular kinds of caregivers, like their grandparents, like their single parents that were just recently divorced from their other parent who has full custody over them. So insofar as we're okay with those cases and we come up with certain kinds of criteria we use to evaluate the associations in those cases, I think that we should feel comfortable extending that to other parties as well. But then maybe your concern is, like, maybe we shouldn't even allow the state to protect those kinds of associations, at which point I'm not sure that I have a particularly persuasive response.
For example, if the state or child welfare systems are the ones who are deciding what counts as sufficient, is there a risk that those decisions could only reflect dominant norms? So that means that families who raise their children differently, but not necessarily harmfully, get judged unfairly or even face intervention when they shouldn't.
Yeah. I definitely am very much alive to that concern of homogenizing our expectations about what good parenting is, or what being a good associate to a child is, etc. And I think that's why I favor sufficiency as the bar for justice for children. So there are two like big views when it comes to the kinds of principles that we could draw on for the purposes of child welfare policy. So there is dual interest sufficientarianism, and there is child-centered maximization. So child-centered maximization, they agree with me in the sense that they think that it's only the interests of children that we should focus on for the purposes of public policy. But where they disagree with me is they say that we should try to organize our social and political institutions such that they benefit children as far as possible. We should maximize the welfare of children. So I think that the sort of concern that you raise about like homogenizing parenting arrangements, like associational arrangements between adults and children, would apply really strongly to the case of like the child-centered maximizer. Because once your goal is to try to promote children's welfare as far as possible, anything where you could provide a good enough argument for saying like that could potentially be bad for children, you start opening the door for like criminalizing or fining those kinds of behaviors. And then I think the homogeneity concern you raise is well-founded there. However, I think when it comes to embracing sufficiency as the standard for justice, so the dual interest sufficientarians are people that believe that our social and political institutions should be arranged so that they benefit children enough. However, enough is understood by them. And the reason that they hold, they want to promote children's interests like less than the maximizers is they say children's interests compete with the interests of their parent. And so if we were to say that children's interests should be promoted as far as possible, that would be too demanding for parents and would make parenting like unpleasant to them. And because of that, we should hold the bar for how far we should promote children's interests like lower. So I agree with the dual interest sufficientarians in that I think that sufficiency is the bar of justice for children. But I disagree that the reason for that is because it's like good for parents if we hold the standard lower. I think that in fact, holding the standard lower, paradoxically perhaps, is like good for children. And we could talk about that more later. But I would say that once we start talking about sufficiency as being the bar of justice for children, the homogeneity concern does not really apply as much there, because what I'm concerned with as a sufficientarian about child welfare is like, I just want to make sure that those arrangements that we know are bad for children should not be sanctioned by the state.
So there's a quite famous film called But I'm a Cheerleader, about a girl who gets sent off to a gay conversion clinic when she's a teenager because her parents suspect her of being gay. And some of the characters in the film run basically a safe house for gay teens. Now, I wonder what you think about a case where that safe house thought, well, we're parked next door to the gay conversion clinic, but we could be doing so much more. There's all these parents who have homophobic views in the way they raise their kids. We should go and kidnap them. And we should have safe houses across the country for kids that have to live under conditions of homophobia, whether the kids are gay or not. That being exposed to those sort of bigoted attitudes is not a sufficiently good life. And so the sooner you get them, the better. And I imagine that, like, let's say a lot of evangelical Christian homes are going to be filled with such bigotry. Can the gay safe havens go out and kidnap with impunity?
Excellent question. And it shows that you read and remember my work, Mark. I really, really appreciate it. Um, yeah. So I guess one clarifying question, because I think it does make a difference. What age are we talking about with these kids?
That's an interesting question. So I wonder what difference it would make. The one view might be the sooner you get them, the better. And in other words, to protect them from the bigotry. The other one, it might be that you sort of, as soon as you find out, so you could have a range of different cases. Do you think there's a point at which it's indefensible? If the kid sort of, buys the views from the parents, they're 10 and they say, yeah, we don't like the gays either. And so now the deprogramming program has to be much more severe. Or do you get them before the kids are even aware of the attitude?
Well, I think that the stage of human development a child is at makes a difference for how morally significant their assenting or dissenting from a particular course of action is. So in my defense of defensive kidnapping, like I restrict my discussion to children aged like 2 to 10. And I'm assuming that there's at least like not vigorous dissent from the child in these sorts of cases. And I think that under those assumptions, there's like a straightforward defense of defensive kidnapping. The picture becomes murkier and more complicated when we introduce like somebody who's trying to abduct a child and the child is actively dissenting. Though I do think there might be some cases in which it might nevertheless be justified. I do think that the picture becomes much murkier. So if there are some children who are at a certain stage of human development and they are dissenting from being abducted in this sort of case, I think that that matters. Whether or not that makes a difference for whether the abduction would be all things considered justified, not sure, would need more details. But then the other thing that I want to say is, okay, so one thing that we know to be true about what's good for children is that children are, especially in their younger years, benefit the most from having a small number of primary caregivers stably and continuously providing them with emotional, relational goods, etc. So if and I do think that there should be in general like a presumption in favor of allowing people to facilitate those goods over a long period of time. The presumption can of course be overturned, perhaps in the cases of these children with these really, really homophobic parents.
So I'll give you a little case that's just to sort of think about, which is assume that one way of ameliorating the resistance from the child is that if the gay kidnappers, have really fun homes. So they've got lots of candy around, they've got like, rainbow colored unicorns, eventually with enough like fun diva style parties, the kids forget about their original Christians. It's so much more fun going to drag screen story hour than it is going to church. Do these sort of like help overcome the kids sort of going, but I miss mommy and daddy?
Good. So the reason that I was bringing up the small number of primary caregivers was because if these children are going to be abducted and then like raised communally, I think that there would be serious problems potentially with respect to safeguarding children's interests sufficiently. But if like these people were abducting the children and then placing them with these like progressive minded families, and it's a small number of primary caregivers who are able to like stably provide children with the goods associated with parenting, maybe that would be fine. And then this question of like, if parents just like if these potential parents make their houses and the upbringing seem like so seductive to the child, Would that offset the potential costs associated with the child being separated from mom and dad? I don't think so. I think that the costs would have to be not just things that the child themselves judge to be good for them, but things that were actually good for the child. So I think that's how I could wriggle out of that sort of case.
So let's say a child's relationship with their parents clearly falls below your sufficiency threshold. It's absolutely neglectful, profoundly alienating, and not in the child's interest. So by your account, the relationship ought not be protected. But what if removing the child from that environment causes its own form of lasting harm, like deep trauma or identity loss or long-term emotional damage? In such a case, the intervention meant to protect the child might actually harm them in a different, more hidden way. So I'm wondering, how would your framework morally evaluate that kind of situation? Like, does it allow for weighing the emotional costs of removal, even when the current relationship doesn't meet the sufficiency standard?
So I do think that there are going to be like better and worse ways of intervening in these sorts of cases. And sometimes the best that we can do for a child is not actually the best for that child. It's just that there will be costs associated with like severed connections, and then perhaps trauma associated with like, why didn't my parents fight for me after I was like removed from their custody? Things like that, I think are quite frankly like unavoidable and really profoundly sad. But I suppose if the alternative to providing the child with some goods in addition to those bads is for the child to live a life of nothing but bad, we should favor giving them some goods, even if that comes with some bads, which might not be satisfying. But I think that when it comes to resolving these issues in the real world, it hardly ever is.
So one thing I'm wondering about in terms of what's in the best interest of the child, and Ella raised this point earlier about thinking about biological parents, and that the general view is that biological parents have a special connection to children. And we might think that they have an obligation to remain in their children's lives. But you also mentioned earlier cases where a parent might have friends and family, who've been in the child's life, maybe, a boyfriend who was there for some period of time. So the one question would be whether it's okay to stop the child from continuing relationships with those non-biological figures. And the other one is whether those people have an obligation to stay in the child's life if that's in the child's interests.
I think that it would be wrong for a parent to prevent a child from associating with a non-parental caregiver whose association with the child is good for the child. The reasons that are often cited for that, and this isn't just like a me opinion. This is people in the philosophical literature have also given arguments to this effect. Of course, they could be wrong, but I'm going to take for granted that they're right. The arguments that they give to this effect is that children have developmental interests in maintaining these sorts of relationships with non-parental caregivers. And in particular, given that parenting, at least the way that it's set up in a lot of Western liberal democracies, they establish what in the Republican tradition people might call monopolies of care. So the parents are the ones that kind of like exercise control over the child's life, their associational habits, etc. But if children are allowed to associate with non-parental caregivers, they might be able to access goods from those caregivers that perhaps their parents would not be able to provide them because I hope it's not a super controversial thing to say that there's like no such thing as a perfect parent. There are always going to be people who lack certain things that children might need, who might give children too much of something. And so perhaps by allowing children to associate with non-parental caregivers, they would be able to access goods from others that would counterbalance some of the bads implicit in the parent-child relationship. So there are these goods that children have a strong interest in. And because they have a strong interest in these goods, I think that it would be wrong for a parent to sever an association between a child and a non-parental caregiver who associates with them in like a robust way. I also think that the very reasons that we could appeal to for why it would be wrong for a parent to sever that connection are likewise reasons we have to think that it would be wrong for the non-parental caregiver themselves to sever the connection, at least without good reason. So there are lots of cases in which there is a single parent who starts dating another person. That person becomes a really big part of the child's life, and then maybe the relationship hits a bumpy patch, and the people in the couple, they have to split ways. And it seems like it would be wrong for this person who has become such an important part of this child's life to just disappear just because of like a romantic failure that happened in their personal lives. And so I want to say that just as we would say that it's wrong for a parent to sever one of these associations because of the goods that the association protects, it would be wrong for a non-parental caregiver to sever an association they have with a child because it would be depriving the child of really important goods.
Well, Connor, I want to thank you for a really fabulous conversation. I always love having you on the show because I think you are really good at fleshing out a position in a clear way and pushing our intuitions in ways that people haven't considered. You often get the most fabulous comments on your videos from people that love what you do or strongly object to what you do. And I think that's a good sign of a good episode. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please give us your comments. Tell us what your favorite Connorisms are. And you can do the same on Spotify as well.